Great. So thank you all for joining today. I'm glad you're all able to attend the conference, and thank you, Seth, for inviting me to join. I'm excited to be able to share some thinking with you all on the perspective of the current state of voice experiences that I've been thinking about and postulating on with a colleague of mine who I'll mention in a second. But voice assistants, just to set the premise for all of this, have quickly become a part of the zeitgeist as conversational technology has taken hold at a global level. And however it is that they've taken over, and however natural as using our voice to communicate with these assistants is, the interaction we have with these voice experiences can sometimes feel very unnatural. And we wanted to uncover and put some thinking towards why that is. And so we feel that we need a more emotional, we see the need for a more emotional intelligence to be woven into our conversations, into our voice experiences, in order to make them more natural, more effective, and ultimately become ways to build and foster relationships with the consumers, the users, and the people on the other end of the conversation. As Seth mentioned, I'll give you a little background on who I am here. So I'm Greg Hedges, Chief Experience Officer at Rain. I oversee our strategy and our user experience departments. I've been helping shape digital experiences for the last 20 years, 10 of them with Rain, and have been working, designing and developing voice experiences since our first Alexa skill in 2015, when there were about 30 skills in the skill store, and now there are over 100,000 here, and it's all over the world. And then we have multiple other assistants that have joined in the fray. So if you're interested in this and you'd like to connect, I'd love to talk to you all, and feel free to reach out at the information there on the screen. I also want to acknowledge a colleague of mine that I mentioned a few moments ago. His name is Sina Khan, and he is the co-founder of a Udemy course called thevoicecourse.co. So if you're interested in learning more about voice, there is a course that he's put together. He also works in biomedical tech in London for a company called The Suitor. We met when he was working on his MBA and started talking, and together we developed this framework. So we're hoping to take this further, talk more about it at other conferences, and also perhaps put some more writing together and put a book is one of our intentions. So if you're interested in what I'm talking about here today, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to share more as we get more of our thinking out there. And to give you a sense of, I'll just take 2 seconds to talk about what Rain is and who we are. We are about 25 people. We have a hub and spoke model across 4 different offices. New York is our main hub, but we have people in Utah as well as in Nicaragua and Seattle. Our team generally falls into the buckets of strategy, creative in the form of user experience, and voice experience design, as well as visual design. And then we have engineers. So we take things from start to finish, from kind of concept and thinking about what we should make all the way through to developing them. And our core services, as mentioned there at the top, are in the formation of voice strategy, the design of voice experiences wherever they live. Doesn't have to be Alexa or Google, but might live in a website or an app. And then the execution of voice search optimization, and helping brands think about how they can become an answer as people begin to search more by their voice. And we work with a number of brands, several of them up there on screen, from industry agnostic, so everything from financial services with BlackRock through to Starbucks and Nike and others. But to get to what I'm here to talk about today, I wanted to start with talking about the relationship between technology and emotion, and just kind of lay out some of the basics of it. I want to start by asking you to think about the last time you spent 5 minutes on your phone, which for most of us won't take that much, take long to go back in our memories about. But think about the emotions that were triggered during that short time span that you spent with that phone. You might get a text from your partner saying they miss you, and you immediately get a sense of joy and happiness that could come from that. Or you might find out that you were booked for a lunch meeting that you really don't want to go on, and you may end up either being apprehensive or maybe even being a bit angry. And so there's an emotion that comes from the interaction that happened there via technology. You might get a notification for a special day that's coming up, and reminding you about something that you need to do. And so your emotions now might be surprise, but also relief that you were kind of granted this information that will help you move forward. And then before you know it, you might find yourself watching a video on YouTube or WhatsApp or somewhere else, and seeing a family rejoined together, or hearing people thanking those on the front line of COVID-19. And it gets you feeling certain emotions, maybe happy and sad all at the same time. And so it's incredible, this mix, this concoction of emotions that can take place within just a few minutes of interacting with these little devices in our hands. And so some of us may think that our relationship with our technology and our devices is purely functional, but we use them to get things done for sure. In reality, though, every function, everything that we do with these devices is emotionally charged, and each interaction that we have is tethered to emotion, like the example that I just had before. And so the next question is a little bit more specific. How do voice assistants impact our emotions directly? If we know that our everyday devices like phones can be emotionally charged, what about devices with a voice? What does having a conversation through technology add to the equation? So to do that, we need to think about these assistants. And not only is a voice assistant a device, which again, from the example we just looked at, already comes with its own kind of concoction of emotions. But now that already emotional inducing entity has a voice with it, it actually has something that brings with it its own characteristics. Voice is its own emotional beast. It's packed with these subtle and also very often not so subtle dimensions of characteristics that fundamentally they impact our interactions, our perceptions, and our emotions of the thing that we're talking to. And we know from studies that have been done that the presence of a voice, the presence of conversation actually does arouse emotions in people. It engages multiple areas of the brain, and it can tap into everything from perception to cognition and to emotion. And so not only does voice trigger emotions in the listener, but a listener also then can detect emotions from the voice that they're hearing on the other end. And the promise of having a conversation via technology, of this voice assistance in the world that we're living in now, is that we'll be able to speak very freely with our devices and have these conversations. But conversations are inherently complex as we think about them. A lot of it's been talked about a bit in the last conversation that we had here with Bing. But to have a really genuine and meaningful conversation, both participants actually have to have some kind of level of emotional intelligence. If we're going to take away and kind of have someone that we want to speak with and build a relationship with, then we need that layer of emotional intelligence that's part of it. And like any real conversation, we're trying to utilize this dialogue we have in this moment right now in order to get to the next one. Again, if the intent is to build a relationship, there are plenty of examples of people that kind of want a one-off in and out, very transactional conversation. But as a steward of a brand, thinking of someone who's hoping to build a relationship with their consumers over time, you want to make sure that you are thinking about how are we going to take people from this moment in time where we found them to the next moment in time, and to the next and to the next, in this kind of cyclical conversation over time. And as we think about it, we could argue that the reason our voice experiences that we have today feel unnatural is that there's a difference between being able to understand something, which they do really well, in terms of being able to break down what one says to an intent. But then tying that into actual comprehension is a whole nother thing. And the ability to do that, the ability to kind of layer on that layer of empathy on top of it, is what separates us from the machines. It separates the people from these assistants and the technology that's on the other end of it. And this is what really defines true emotional intelligence when we think about it. And so then, our posit here is that voice experiences have to have more emotional intelligence, since we know that voice can cause this to happen. We need to ensure that our voice experiences are imbued with characteristics that will allow for that to happen. And this is possible as we think about the signals that are being sent out there. When we put in an analog of who we are speaking to when we're in person, there are tons of signals that we take from it. There's our facial reactions, there's the tone that we use in our voice, there's the context of the situation that we're in, which brings in all sorts of meaning. If we're interacting with someone in a store, there's a certain setting that's involved. If I'm searching around an aisle and someone can tell I'm looking for something, versus in another part of the store where I'm at the front desk and I may have a problem. So that context really becomes critical. And if we really investigate the conversations that a brand is trying to have with a consumer via a voice experience, we do actually have a lot of context that we can bring into it. We have data on general consumer behavior. Sometimes we have it from the exact consumer that we're speaking with. So for instance, we worked on an experience for Starbucks where the user is logged in with their Starbucks account. We know everything they've ordered in their order history, where they ordered from, where they might be right now. So we have a lot of information. We also have, similar to an in-person conversation, we have situational context. We have things like the time of day. We have the premise through which the experience even exists. And we have the ability to in the end, shape the words that we put in the mouths of these assistants via these apps that we build. And so it's important to think about how we can do that. And so I guess if we think about then, if we have all these signals that we can use, why can't we do a better job of using these to our advantage in our voice experiences? And the answer is that we absolutely can, by positioning voice experiences as ambassadors of emotional intelligence. And that's the framework that we've started to put together there. Sorry, I'm a dad of a 7 and a 6-year-old, so dad joke in there for you guys. But the idea, though, and what led us to the thinking that Sina and I put together, was this framework for emotional intelligent voice experience design. And we have this 4 facet model that starts in the top left with motivation. And we'll walk through each of these quickly as we get through the presentation here. But it starts with this concept of this multifaceted model that looks to the factors that motivate people to even come to a conversation in the first place. And then how do they use those triggers, those motivational triggers, as they inquire further and explore the conversation with us? And then how can we use that initial exploration to build in familiarity and draw them closer to the point that we actually create a bond? And then how do we utilize those bonds that we've built, those initial bonds that we formed, in order to bring them back again and again, so that it's important. This isn't just kind of a one pass around type of thing. It's something that it's cyclical, and it gets tighter as it goes. We need to still motivate people to come back. We need to get them to re-explore us. We need to get more context with them and build more familiarity with them. And that relationship, then that bond, hopefully becomes stronger to the point where eventually we don't have to push them into the conversation. We just need to be there for them when they're ready to have it. And so we'll take a look at these a little bit further here and individually. So if we look at the first facet in this, which is motivation, we're specifically looking at what motivates someone to engage in a conversation with us in the first place. And then later on, come back. So what drives it forward by getting them to come back for more. And motivation is an important place to start when we consider designing emotionally intelligent voice experiences, because motivation is the spark to the fire in it all. Motivators coupled with ability are the stimuli to do something. They cause us to act, to click, to inquire, or in the case of a voice experience, to invoke it. It's the why to the what someone does. It's the influence behind it all. And as we think about motivators and what can bring people in and the different forms it can take, there's different sides of that. There's the rational side of motivators that exist, which are intrinsic. They're need-based. They can propel an individual toward a certain goal or behavior. As it relates to voice, rational motivators are really important in getting people to consider what they're going to interact with, how we're going to tap into those important needs that they have. On the other side of that, emotional motivators, they may tug at the heartstrings of a need, but channel different qualities, narrowing in on desire. These motivators are kind of a want and needs clothing, if you will. And as it relates to voice, emotional motivators can range widely from activations that bring people in, so different ads that we might tap into these different desires. And it can be part of the experience itself. So again, it's just first about getting people there, but then once they're in, we have to bring them back. So it could be about something that happened within the experience, from the way that we talked about what we offer, or any of the other things that are part of the value proposition of the experience itself. There are different mechanics that we need to think about with motivation, which range in a variety of ways, but these mechanics are things that we can operate on once we understand them. So there's the awareness. Do people understand it? And is it something that's latent? Are they aware of it? Something that exists, this voice assistant or this voice experience that's out there, but they haven't operated on it? Or there's a more active part of that when they are aware of it, but now they need to take action and come in and try to actually invoke the conversation to happen. There's authority that we need to think about in a sea of answers that exist in the digital world. The consumer needs to have a place of true authority. They're looking for an answer, and they don't want to be given a bunch of them. And so they want to feel like they're coming to a voice of authority. And so there's something that we can tap into there. There's enticement. There's always a level of attraction, a sexiness factor into how we pick our mate out in the crowd, kind of who we want to have a relationship with. And for voice, it's how we decide what type of skill we want to invoke or action that we want to explore. There's different types of value. So there's the intrinsic value, the value the experience has on its own merit, what it brings to the table. And then there's the imbued value. So the value that the user perceives the experience to have. And then there's also findability. How can we actually, when we're ready to act, is it something that's there? Can we find it? And how do we do that? So there's a lot of things that we need to be prepared for. And so as we think about how we can apply those factors there's a number of different ways. We can think about enablement. So just even the premise through which something exists. How are we enabling a behavior that's going to make something easier for someone, make someone happy if that's the intent of it? The Uber skill is an example of that. You can easily just ask for an Uber and use a voice experience. It's actually simpler than going to the mobile app, should you know where you're going, especially if it's someplace you go often. And so, that helps people, it enables people, and it makes it simpler for them to perform behavior. And so they're more interested in having a conversation with us because it just is better for them. We can think about activation and discoverability. So we need to make sure people know we exist. So from a motivation perspective, it's how we communicate with people. It's how we put ourselves out there, perhaps, and activate them via packaging for a product they've purchased, or it might be an advertisement they've seen. And this is an area where people often fail in voice right now. They don't think about the fact that they have to let people know that they're there, that they're available for a conversation. We also need to make sure we're discoverable, that we have utterances, so different phrases and words that we're using that people who are looking to have a conversation can use in order to trigger a conversation, both directly when they know that we exist, but both also indirectly via some of these platforms and the implicit invocations that exist as part of them. We need to deliver on that authority. We worked on an experience for Tide, the laundry detergent brand, and they're an authority on stains. People want an answer from someone and that they can trust when they have something like that they need some help with. And so they're looking for that voice of authority, and that trust is an important factor in that. And being able to deliver that answer and deliver an authoritative presence is important. Value proposition I mentioned before, we need to make sure that's very clear. And that we're making sure people understand that we exist and that what we can do for them. We also need to think about the production value and the immersion that's part of it. Bring people in as they get into that experience. Think about the way we're using sound and the way we're using synthetic voices versus recordings of voices, and a number of other elements that are part of that. And then lastly, we need to think about gamifying the experience. And that doesn't mean in creating a leaderboard or creating something that is a game in the true sense of that. But there are things that we can do in order to draw the user closer and use elements of gamification to let them know that they've completed something or how much of something exists, to tap into some of those motivating factors that can bring them back. The second facet here is exploration, and these will move quickly, so I'll jump here through exploration, but this is when the user is motivated enough to inquire further and explore your voice experience. And these early interactions that take place in the exploration stage are really important because first impressions really matter. We know that there's an evolutionary basis to this. When our ancestors found themselves in a bad situation, their fight or flight mechanisms kicked into place, and they would get out of there. They couldn't risk being in a bad situation. It was a survival mechanism. And so, we see that happen in our life all the time. When we don't have a positive experience, we don't want to return to it. Sometimes we have to, and that's not a good situation for anyone to be in, especially if you're on the other side of it. But, we find that if we reach a point of internal resistance towards something, we're not going to go back to it. And some of the things that we think about here are we try to compare it to a first date. which often then can become a second date, hopefully, and so on and so forth until you actually build a relationship. But here in an exploration phase, that first date is really important. We know that anywhere between, it's been said, about 3 to 6%, and that number changes from time to time, of voice experiences get used again. In other words, only 3 to 6% of voice experiences get past the first date, which is not great. But if we think about what's behind that, they are doing a lot of things wrong that you wouldn't give advice to for someone who's actually going on a date to do for the person on the other side. And so we think about this in a few different principles. One, generating awareness. Do they make you aware of who they are and what they're about? You've got to find the right balance in order to communicate what you offer to someone without overwhelming them. And you can imagine going in and just being a braggart on a first date and talk about everything you do and everything that you've ever done and what you bring to the table. But those early interactions are really important, and they tell the other person on the other side of the table, a lot about you. And so you need to make sure that you're sharing enough, but not oversharing. Generate awareness, but be careful. We need to provide a sense of convenient utility. On a date level between two people, do you seem like a gimmick, or do you provide some real usefulness to the person on the other side? And in the case of voice, does the voice app have a clear value proposition that it can deliver on? Tide is an example of that again. It's more conversation. It's more convenient for you, using the example I said before, to have a conversational experience by voice than to go through an app or a website or some other means, because your hands are tied up in that moment. And so voice is the best way of getting that information. Personality is another important principle here. One of the main elements of an emotionally intelligent conversation is going to be personality. Did this person that you're on a date with have a distinct character? Or was this person as vanilla as others you've dated? People are going to imbue personality on a voice experience, even if you don't attempt to, but you should make an attempt to, and you should define the voice and tone of your brand and of the channels like a voice experience that are part of that. Are you humorous or are you serious? What words are you choosing to put into the mouth? What puns are you trying to weave in, if you are even trying to do that, or are you being more serious? How you flex your personality is up to you, but it's going to communicate something. So you need to tailor that to the audience and the conversation that you're looking to have. Personalization is important. Were they interested in you? Did they remember things like the fact that you're a vegetarian, or that you like white wine and not red? And so personalization becomes really critical. We need to remember those parts of the conversation that have been brought to us by the person on the other end of it, and make sure that we're bringing them back in and providing this sense that we know them. And that's true in any digital context, in any relationship context. But in a voice experience, it's important to use those signals to make sure that we're tailoring the voice experience to the individuals. We need to understand multimodality. Were we enjoyable to be around only at the bar where we were having this date, or is the charm that you have there adaptable to other settings? Can I bring you home to mom and dad? In a voice experience context, it has to work in different places. And it has to work in different moments of my life. And so when you think about something like Google Assistant, it's a really good example of a voice assistant that is multimodal. Like you can talk to it in a private setting where you don't want to be speaking out loud via text if you need to, via the Google Assistant app, or you can switch and you can go into voice when you're ready to in your car or another device that you have at home. And the last tier is recovery. Do you know how to recover from a bad joke or an awkward situation in one of those contexts of a date? Or in the case of voice, when you hit a conversation error. So if someone takes the conversation off track, can you guide it back on? Can you recover? And can you make it go from an unhappy path back to a happier path by guiding it back and avoiding some of those negative situations, but also, when you can avoid them, recovering from them. Familiarity is the third facet here. It's important that people feel like we're getting to know them. That goes back to one of those principles that I just mentioned there, but we really need to understand what's happening. And we know that if exploration is about the first date, the next step towards building a relationship with them and getting a second date is familiarity. And so we need to make sure that we're really building in some of that, because we know, as I mentioned before, that if we feel a bad situation is present, we're going to leave. But also, similarly, the mere exposure effect, the more we're exposed to something, the more likely we are to come back to it. So familiarity is really critical. The sense of familiarity we have with the voice experience should grow progressively stronger over time. And that can be done in a lot of ways. We can harness this by building context, and the user bringing conversation and coming back more and more is going to breed more and more context. And that context is going to breed more and more familiarities. And there's a few different ways we can do that. We can look back at the motivators that brought them there in the first place. There's a premise for why they're there. What is it? What are those needs? And can we use those? We can ask for information from them. So they're giving us things as they're having a conversation. They're giving us interactions. They're giving us indications of the things that they're interested in. We can connect in with our ecosystem. I mentioned the Starbucks example. If we have the ability to log in, or we're connected because of another system where we know who they are, then let's use that data that we've been collecting, hopefully, and using that in order to create that context. And then we can also fall back on norms, whether that be cultural or natural norms. We can use the time of day. We can use that situational context that exists in order to make our relationship stronger. And the very last stage of this is a bond. And in the end, it's not so much I guess, a stage as it is a thread that ties all of these other facets of this model together. It's the ultimate goal that we're trying to get to, but it's not an endpoint because we're using that to spur the next conversation. If we think about it, it's when we're in a relationship, a bond is the thing that we want when we don't have it. And then once we have it, it's the thing that we want to hold on to. And so we need to make sure that we're kind of thinking about that we're planning around that, and that we're not having one night stands, that we're planning for long-term conversations with people. And so we need to make sure that we're breeding that into our voice experiences from, again, welcoming people back, having a sense of that context again of what it is that what they've done before, and making the experience tailored towards that. It's also about being transparent. A lot of relationships are stronger when they're transparent. And so how can we do that? There's an analog for restaurants and kitchens that are open kitchen plans are a way of the restaurant industry being transparent and showing a little bit more of what's behind them. And so we need to think about ways that we can be transparent and let people know and set expectations for what the conversation that we're able to have, and set some rules around the conversations that we're not able to have. And so in any event, there's a number of questions still to be posited here and thought about on how to actually cement a bond with someone. But we feel that if people are leveraging a model like this, where they can bring people into the experience through these motivators, get them to explore a conversation with us, become familiar with them over time, and use that context in order to strengthen the relationship, that we can build a bond that will become cyclical in nature and bring people back. And again, there's a lot of work to be done here, but hopefully that made sense. And yes, I am not sure if there's time for questions, Seth, but happy to take any if there are.
Yeah, you have a couple of minutes for questions. Do we have any questions for Greg? People can enter them in the Q&A, or you can raise your hand if you do it quickly, and we'll pass the mic to you. Any questions for Greg? Going to give it a few seconds. All right, well, seeing none, I will thank you, Greg, for presenting. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, we have a question in the Q&A from Jacqueline Gordon. What are the major contributors to the 3 to 6% VUI return rate?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is with any new technology, there's a rush of people that, especially one that's been democratized in the way that voice experiences have through platforms like Amazon Alexa and Google Assistant and others. There's this rush. There's a bunch of meaningful experiences that are built, and there's a bunch of fluff that's built. And so some experiences, weren't, people didn't think about bringing people back. They just thought to do it because they could. And so there's a number of those out there, which there's a lot of catfax skills and, other kind of people playing at the fringes of what's possible, but that aren't thinking about that. And I think for us, we think a big reason also is that they're built to be right now very transactional. Um, and they're thinking about like low effort. Let's just make it easy for somebody to do something. But they're not thinking about the emotional side of it, which is why we've thought about this model. They're not thinking about, you know, the relationship they want to build over time, and they're not building an experience that people should come back to. They're not building in elements that make it attractive to come back to. And so I think that's for us, you know, what we're seeing right now in terms of why there's some issues like that. And the numbers getting better. I think, you know, again, as platforms mature, as voice people become more familiar with it, and as platforms mature, you will see more of you see more adoption and people coming back. But even with mobile apps and other technology, we do still see, you know, low retention rates. And so the goal is always to make that relationship as strong as possible and get people to come back.